Hello there, and welcome to The Weary Researcher, where curiosity gets cozy and wonder takes on a whisper. Tonight, we're drifting into one of the most mind-bending what-if scenarios physics has ever dared to imagine. What would happen if time itself decided to run backwards, not just slowing down or speeding up, but actually reversing its flow like a cosmic film played in rewind? Now, before we begin our gentle journey through this temporal puzzle, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right there in your corner of reality? It's always fascinating to think that while you're settling in for the night somewhere, someone else might be watching the sunrise, all of us moving forward through time together, moment by moment. If you enjoy these sleepy explorations into the deeper mysteries of our universe, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this video a gentle like and perhaps subscribed. It helps more curious souls find their way to this cozy corner of science, and it means we can keep wandering through these beautiful questions together. Now, I do hope this isn't so captivating that it keeps you awake, but if it does, well, at least you'll drift off with some truly extraordinary ideas floating through your mind. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let's begin to unravel what might be the strangest thought experiment in all of physics. Imagine for a moment that you're watching a movie of your day, but someone has pressed rewind. Your morning coffee leaps back into the cup. The cream swirls backward, separating into perfect spirals. Raindrops fly upward from puddles, returning to clouds overhead, and that text message you sent earlier somehow unsends itself, floating back through the digital ether to nestle safely in your drafts folder. This isn't just whimsy or science fiction. This is a serious question that has puzzled physicists for over a century. What would actually happen if the arrow of time, the fundamental direction that carries us from past to future, suddenly pointed the other way? And the answer, as we'll discover, is far stranger and more beautiful than you might imagine. The very idea of time reversal touches something deep in our understanding of reality. Time feels so fundamental, so unquestionably one-directional, that imagining it any other way seems almost absurd. And yet, when we look closely at the laws of physics, something curious emerges. Most of the equations that govern our universe work perfectly well, whether time moves forward or backward. They are what physicists call time symmetric, meaning they don't actually care which direction time is flowing. But if that's true, then why does time seem to have such a clear direction? Why do we remember the past but not the future? Why does a dropped glass shatter but never spontaneously reassemble? And what would our world look like if this cosmic arrow suddenly turned around? To understand what would happen in a time-reversed universe, we need to gently explore one of the most important concepts in all of physics: entropy. You might remember entropy from school as a measure of disorder, but it's actually much more subtle and beautiful than that. Entropy is the universe's way of keeping track of how many different ways things can be arranged. And here's the key insight: there are always far more ways for things to be disorganized than organized. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a pristine glass of water sitting peacefully on a table. There's really only one way for that glass to be whole and perfect, but there are countless ways for it to be broken into pieces, scattered across the floor. Big shards, small shards, fragments of every conceivable size and shape. The number of possible broken arrangements vastly outnumbers the single perfect arrangement. This is why glasses break but don't spontaneously repair themselves. Why perfume spreads through a room but doesn't gather itself back into the bottle. Why your bedroom gradually becomes messy unless you actively tidy it. The universe naturally tends toward the arrangements that are most probable, and those happen to be the disorganized ones. But here's where things get deliciously strange. In a time-reversed world, this fundamental tendency would flip on its head. Entropy would decrease rather than increase. We would witness impossible scenes of spontaneous organization. Shattered glass would leap up from the floor, its fragments finding each other with perfect precision. reassembling into wholeness. Spilled coffee would flow backward into cups. Cream would separate from coffee, swirling into perfect spirals before disappearing entirely. Imagine watching a candle in this backwards world. Instead of melting and dripping wax, the candle would grow taller as droplets of wax flowed upward against gravity, somehow knowing exactly where they belonged. The flame would burn backward, consuming not fuel but somehow creating it. The very air around the candle would become more ordered, not less, but these violations of our everyday experience of entropy are just the beginning. In a time-reversed universe, every process we take for granted would transform into something magical and impossible. Heat would flow from cold objects to hot ones. Ice cubes would warm up the drinks they touched. Fires would absorb energy from their surroundings, growing colder while making everything else warmer. The implications stretch far beyond simple thermodynamics. In our forward-flowing time universe, energy always spreads out from concentrated sources. The sun radiates heat into space, engines convert fuel into motion, and waste heat flows from hot places to cold ones. But reverse time's arrow, and energy would spontaneously concentrate. Hot spots would form out of nowhere, drawing energy from their cooler surroundings. This isn't just about breaking a few physical laws, it's about fundamentally rewiring the entire structure of cause and effect. In our normal world, causes precede effects. You flip a switch and then a light turns on. You speak and then someone hears you. You plant a seed and eventually a tree grows. But in a backwards time universe, effects would precede their causes. Lights would turn on and then switches would flip. Sounds would be heard before they were spoken. Trees would shrink back into seeds that then get planted. The concept challenges our deepest assumptions about reality and leads us into territory that seems to blur the line between physics and philosophy. How would consciousness work in such a universe? Would we experience events before they happened? Would our thoughts flow backward through time? Would we remember the future instead of the past? Consider how memories form in our brains. When you create a memory, neurons in your brain change their connections in specific ways. This process requires energy and generates heat, increasing the entropy of your brain slightly. So, our ability to remember is intimately tied to time's forward arrow. In a time-reversed world, this process would work in reverse. Memories would spontaneously disappear as neural connections undid themselves, while somehow knowledge of future events would spontaneously appear. But perhaps most unsettling of all would be the reversal of the cosmic arrow of time itself. Our universe is expanding, cooling down as galaxies drift apart and stars gradually burn out. In a time-reversed cosmos, we would witness the opposite. Galaxies would rush toward each other. The cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang, would grow hotter and more intense rather than cooler. Stars would shrink and heat up rather than expand and cool. The universe itself would be contracting, heading not toward a cold, empty future, but toward a hot, dense past that we might call a big crunch. Everything that has ever happened in cosmic history would play backward. Supernovas would collapse inward, drawing in their scattered elements. Planets would spiral into their parent stars. Solar systems would dissolve as their components merged back into primordial clouds of gas and dust. Yet here's what makes this thought experiment so fascinating and strange. While the macroscopic world would be full of impossible backwards processes, the microscopic world would continue to operate normally. Individual atoms and molecules would still follow the same quantum mechanical rules. Their interactions would remain fundamentally unchanged. It's only when we zoom out to see the collective behavior of countless particles that the backwards flow of time would become apparent. This reveals something profound about the nature of time itself. The arrow of time isn't built into the fundamental laws of physics. Instead, it emerges from the statistical behaviour of vast numbers of particles. It's not that individual particles care about time's direction, it's that when you have trillions upon trillions of them, they collectively tend toward more probable arrangements. In our forward time universe, those probable arrangements happen to be more disordered ones, but flip assistance times arrow, and suddenly the most probable arrangements become more ordered ones. The universe would spontaneously organize itself into increasingly intricate patterns, not because the laws of physics have changed, but because the statistical tide has turned. This statistical nature of time's arrow leads to one of the most beautiful paradoxes in physics, known as Loschmidt's paradox, named after the Austrian physicist Joseph Loschmidt, who first articulated it in the 1800s. If the microscopic laws of physics are time-symmetric, then why does the macroscopic world show such a clear preference for one direction of time? The resolution to this paradox lies in the special initial conditions of our universe. When the universe began in the Big Bang, it started in an extraordinarily low entropy state. Everything was smooth, uniform, and highly ordered. From this special beginning, the universe has been steadily increasing in entropy ever since, creating the arrow of time we experience. But imagine if the universe had started in a high entropy state instead. Then, time's arrow would point in the opposite direction, toward decreasing entropy and increasing order. We would live in a universe where broken things spontaneously repaired themselves, where disorder gave way to organization, where the natural tendency would be toward greater beauty and complexity rather than decay. This brings us to one of the most mind-bending realizations about time reversal. It's not just a thought experiment about physics, it's a window into the deepest questions about why our universe is the way it is. Why did the universe begin in such a special, low-entropy state? What would reality be like if it had started differently? And perhaps most mysteriously, is our experience of time's arrow fundamental to consciousness itself? Or could aware beings exist in a universe where time flowed backward? As we drift deeper into this exploration, we'll discover that the reversal of time touches every aspect of existence, from the quantum realm, where wave functions would uncollapse and uncertainty would give way to certainty, to the biological world, where evolution would run in reverse and complexity would dissolve into simplicity. We'll explore how information itself would behave in a backwards universe, where knowledge would spontaneously disappear and the future would become more knowable than the past. We'll contemplate what would happen to causality, to free will, to the very structure of logic and reason when effects precede their causes. And we'll journey to the edges of physics, where the reversal of time intersects with some of the deepest mysteries of modern science, quantum mechanics, general relativity, and the search for a theory of everything. The question of what would happen if time ran backwards isn't just an idle curiosity, it's a probe into the fundamental nature of reality itself. So as we continue our gentle exploration of this impossible universe, remember that we're not just playing with abstract concepts, we're touching something essential about what it means to exist in a world where time flows forward, where entropy increases, where causes precede effects, and where consciousness can remember the past while remaining forever uncertain about the future. The backwards universe we're imagining is a mirror held up to our own reality, showing us, by contrast, just how remarkable and special our forward-flowing world truly is. It's a reminder that the arrow of time that carries us from moment to moment is not just a physical phenomenon, but perhaps one of the most beautiful and mysterious features of existence itself. But perhaps the most startling transformation in our time-reversed world would occur in the realm of the living. Imagine a forest where autumn leaves don't fall, but instead rise from the ground, assembling themselves onto bare branches, their browns and golds fading back into vibrant greens, as trees grow younger and taller with each passing moment. Flowers would close their petals, drawing nectar back into their stems, while bees flew backward, carrying pollen away from blossoms rather than toward them. In this backwards biological world, evolution itself would run in reverse. Complex organisms would gradually simplify, shedding adaptations and capabilities over generations. What we might call devolution would be the natural order. Humans would grow simpler, apes would become more primitive, mammals would dissolve back into earlier forms of life. Eventually, all the magnificent diversity of the living world would flow backward toward the primordial simplicity from which it emerged. The very process of growth and development would invert. Babies would not grow into children, but rather children would shrink into babies. Knowledge and skills painstakingly acquired over years would spontaneously disappear. Languages would become simpler, losing words and complexity until communication itself began to fade away. The accumulated wisdom of civilizations would unravel as libraries emptied themselves and scholars forgot what they once knew. Yet, within individual lifespans, the experience would be even stranger. Imagine aging in reverse, not just growing younger in body, but actually experiencing life's events in backward sequence. You might find yourself in a heated argument with a friend, only to discover later that the disagreement was actually a reconciliation that came before a period of harmony. You might receive a diploma before attending school, or find yourself grieving a loss before experiencing the joy of what was lost. This reversal of personal history would create a profound disorientation, where the very concept of learning and growth would become meaningless. Instead of gaining experience and wisdom over time, beings would lose them, gradually becoming more naive and less capable as they aged backward through their lives. The elderly would be the most innocent and unknowing, while the young would possess wisdom they could never explain. But the strangeness extends even deeper into the biological realm. Consider how our bodies maintain themselves in forward time. We eat food, breaking it down into energy and building blocks for growth and repair. Waste products are eliminated, and cells constantly replace themselves through division and renewal. In a time-reversed world, this entire maintenance system would operate in reverse. Food would spontaneously assemble itself in our stomachs, complex nutrients forming from simpler waste products. Our bodies would excrete perfectly organised meals while somehow managing to extract energy from this backwards process. Cells would merge rather than divide, reducing in number as they combined into larger, less specialised units. The intricate dance of metabolism would become a process of increasing organisation rather than breakdown. The implications for consciousness in such a world are profound. If our thoughts and memories depend on the physical processes of the brain, then backwards time would fundamentally alter the nature of mind itself. Thoughts might form before the experiences that inspired them. Memories might appear as predictions of events that haven't yet happened. The stream of consciousness would flow backward, carrying us not from past impressions toward future possibilities, but from future certainties toward past uncertainties. Consider how decision-making would work in such a reversed world. In our normal experience, we gather information, contemplate options, and then choose a course of action. But in backwards time, the sequence would invert. We would first act, then contemplate, and finally gather the information that led to our decision. Free will itself might seem to operate in reverse, with choices appearing to emerge from their consequences rather than causing them. The social world would transform in equally bewildering ways. Conversations would begin with farewells and end with greetings. Relationships would start with breakups and gradually develop into meetings. Friendships would dissolve into the initial wariness of strangers, while enemies might find themselves growing closer until they became friends who had never met. The entire fabric of social interaction would unweave itself as bonds loosened and connections faded. Imagine cities in this backwards world, where construction would mean the careful disassembly of buildings, materials flowing away from construction sites until empty lots remained. Roads would crack and crumble as the asphalt separated back into its component parts while traffic flowed backward, with vehicles somehow managing to coordinate their reverse movements perfectly. Bridges would collapse gracefully, their pieces floating apart and settling into neat piles of raw materials. Technology, too, would run in reverse. Computers would become simpler, losing capabilities and processing power as their components separated and simplified. The internet would fragment as connections dissolved and information scattered. Phones would lose their ability to communicate, becoming nothing more than inert plastic and metal objects. The entire digital revolution would play backward as humanity collectively forgot how to build and operate complex machines. Yet perhaps most unsettling would be the reversal of information itself. In our forward-flowing world, information accumulates and spreads. We learn new things, discover new facts, and share knowledge with others. But in a backwards universe, information would spontaneously disappear. Books would empty themselves as words flowed back into the minds of their authors, who would then forget what they had written. Scientific knowledge would evaporate as experiments undid themselves and observations were forgotten. Theories would dissolve back into ignorance, and the great edifice of human understanding would crumble stone by stone, leaving behind only the innocent unknowing of our earliest ancestors. Mathematics would simplify, losing its elegant complexity as equations unproved themselves and numbers forgot how to relate to one another. The very concept of education would become meaningless, as teachers would somehow extract knowledge from their students, returning to their own earlier state of ignorance. Libraries would empty themselves as information flowed backward from books to minds and then disappeared entirely, leaving behind only blank pages and silent shelves. The accumulated heritage of human thought would unravel like a tapestry, being carefully unwoven, thread by thread. In this backwards world, even language itself would simplify and fade. Complex sentences would break apart into simpler phrases, then into individual words, and finally into meaningless sounds. The poetry that captures the beauty of human experience would dissolve back into silence, leaving behind only the quiet breathing of beings who had lost the power to name their world. But here's where the backwards universe reveals something profound about the nature of information and knowledge. In our forward-flowing world, these things don't just exist. They emerge from the organized activity of conscious beings thinking, learning, communicating with one another. Information is not a thing, but a process. Not a substance, but a pattern of organization that requires energy and effort to maintain. When time runs backward, this organizational process reverses. Knowledge doesn't just disappear, it actively dissolves as the energy that went into creating it flows back out. The universe becomes not just less informed, but actively anti-informed as patterns of meaning unweave themselves and return to the chaos from which they came. This dissolution of information would extend to the very records of history. In our normal world, we preserve the past through photographs, fossils, written accounts, and physical traces that allow us to reconstruct what came before. But in a backwards universe, these records would spontaneously erase themselves. Photographs would fade to blank film, fossils would dissolve back into the rocks that contained them, and written histories would unwrite themselves. The past, which in our world becomes increasingly knowable through archaeology and historical research, would become increasingly mysterious as its traces disappeared. The future, by contrast, might somehow become more predictable as the backwards flow of time revealed what was to come rather than concealing it. This would create a strange inversion of knowledge, where beings might somehow know what would happen but remain forever ignorant of what had already occurred. Even the tools we use to understand the world would operate differently. Scientific instruments would give readings before measurements were taken. Telescopes would show us images that hadn't yet been captured by light travelling from distant stars. Microscopes would reveal details before we looked through them. The very process of observation, which in our world creates knowledge, would, in a backwards world, somehow destroy it. This reversal of the observational process touches on some of the deepest mysteries of quantum mechanics, where the act of measurement plays a fundamental role in determining reality. In our forward-flowing world, quantum systems exist in superposition until they're observed, collapsing into definite states only when measured. But in a backwards universe, this process might reverse, with definite states spontaneously expanding into superposition as measurements were somehow unmade. The implications stretch beyond science into the realm of art and creativity. In our world, artists create beauty by organizing materials and ideas into new patterns. Musicians arrange sounds into melodies. Writers combine words into stories. But in a backwards universe, this creative process would invert. Masterpieces would dissolve back into raw materials. Symphonies would separate into random notes, and stories would unravel into meaningless sequences of words. The very concept of beauty, which emerges from organization, pattern, and complexity, would fade as everything became simpler and less ordered. The magnificent complexity that we associate with artistic achievement would give way to an ever-increasing simplicity, until nothing remained but the most basic elements arranged in the most random ways. Yet in contemplating this impossible world, we begin to appreciate something profound about our own reality. The arrow of time that carries us forward is not just a physical phenomenon, but the very foundation of everything we value. Knowledge, beauty, meaning, complexity, consciousness itself, all depend on time flowing in the direction it does. All emerge from the universe's journey, from simplicity toward complexity, from order toward greater disorder in the most beautiful and meaningful ways. Our forward-flowing world is a place where entropy increases, but life finds ways to create pockets of decreasing entropy, where random processes give rise to pattern and meaning, where the simple becomes complex and the unconscious becomes aware. It's a universe where time's arrow doesn't just determine which way events unfold, but makes possible the very existence of events worth unfolding. As we drift deeper into our exploration of this backwards realm, we'll discover how even the most fundamental aspects of physics would transform, how quantum mechanics would operate in reverse, how gravity itself might behave differently, and how the very structure of space and time would need to reshape itself to accommodate this impossible flow. But for now, let your mind rest gently on these strange inversions, these impossible processes that reveal, by contrast, the miracle of the world we actually inhabit. The quantum realm in our backwards universe would become a stage for even stranger performances than we might expect in the forward-flowing world. Quantum mechanics already challenges our everyday intuitions about reality with its superpositions, uncertainties, and mysterious entanglements. But reverse the arrow of time, and these quantum phenomena would transform into something almost unrecognizable. Consider the fundamental process of wave function collapse. In our normal world, quantum particles exist in multiple states simultaneously until the moment they are observed or measured, at which point they collapse into a single, definite state. But in a time-reversed universe, this process would invert. Instead of collapsing into certainty, particles would spontaneously expand from definite states into fuzzy clouds of possibility. Imagine watching an electron that had been precisely located suddenly begin to spread out, becoming less and less certain in its position as time flowed backward. What was once a sharp point of reality would gradually diffuse into a ghostly probability cloud, as if the very act of knowing where something was would somehow cause it to become unknowable. This reversal of quantum measurement would create a universe where knowledge itself became unstable. The more precisely we tried to pin down the properties of particles, the more they would slip away from us. Certainty would spontaneously decay into uncertainty as the quantum world actively resisted our attempts to understand it. The very foundations of scientific measurement would crumble as instruments gave readings that became less accurate over time. But perhaps most mysteriously, quantum entanglement, those spooky connections between particles that Einstein found so troubling, would operate in reverse. In our forward-flowing world, when two particles become entangled, measuring one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. But in backwards time, this connection would work differently. Entangled particles would somehow become disentangled as their mysterious connection spontaneously dissolved. What was once a unified quantum system would separate into independent parts, losing the instantaneous correlation that had bound them together across space. The universe would gradually lose its quantum connectedness as these ethereal bonds weakened and finally snapped. The implications for quantum tunneling would be equally strange. In our normal world, particles can sometimes pass through barriers that should be impossible to cross, appearing on the other side without ever having enough energy to go over or around. But in reversed time, this process would invert. Particles would spontaneously appear inside barriers that they should never have been able to enter, as if the universe was somehow stuffing them into impossible places. Radioactive decay, that reliable quantum process where unstable atoms randomly transform into more stable ones, would run completely backward. In a time-reversed world, stable atoms would spontaneously become unstable, absorbing energy from their surroundings and transforming into more complex radioactive isotopes. Carbon would absorb energy and become carbon-14. Rocks would become more radioactive over time rather than less. This reversal of radioactive decay would wreak havoc with our methods of dating ancient objects. Carbon dating relies on the steady decay of radioactive carbon over thousands of years, but in backwards time, these atomic clocks would run in reverse, making it impossible to determine the age of anything. Instead of revealing the past through the steady ticking of atomic decay, we would find ourselves in a world where the past became increasingly mysterious. Even the quantum vacuum, that seemingly empty space that actually teems with virtual particles popping in and out of existence, would behave differently. These quantum fluctuations that normally appear and disappear randomly would somehow become more organized in backwards time. The vacuum would spontaneously create increasingly complex patterns of virtual particles, as if empty space itself were becoming more structured and meaningful. The uncertainty principle, that fundamental limit on how precisely we can know both the position and momentum of a particle, might operate in reverse. Instead of being limited by an irreducible minimum of uncertainty, we might find that uncertainty spontaneously decreased over time, allowing us to know things about quantum particles that should be unknowable. But the most profound transformation would occur in how quantum systems evolve. In our forward-flowing world, the Schrödinger equation describes how quantum states change over time, evolving from initial conditions toward future possibilities. But in backwards time, this evolution would invert. Future quantum states would somehow determine past ones, creating a universe where quantum destiny flowed backward through time. This reversal would challenge our deepest assumptions about causality in quantum mechanics. In the forward world, quantum measurements create definite outcomes from indefinite possibilities, but in backwards time, definite outcomes would somehow uncreate themselves, dissolving back into the quantum foam from which they emerged. Reality itself would become less real as time progressed. Imagine quantum computers in such a backwards world. Instead of processing information by manipulating quantum states, they would somehow unprocess it, taking complex calculations and reducing them to simpler ones. Quantum algorithms would run in reverse, taking answers and converting them back into questions. The very concept of quantum computation would invert as these machines became quantum decomputators. The famous double-slit experiment, where particles behave like waves when unobserved, but like particles when measured, would play out differently in backwards time. The wave-like interference patterns would spontaneously collapse into particle-like behavior even without measurement, as if the universe were gradually forgetting how to be wave-like and remembering only how to be particle-like. But here's where the backwards quantum world reveals something beautiful about the nature of observation and consciousness. In our normal universe, the act of measurement seems to play a fundamental role in creating definite reality from indefinite possibility. But in backwards time, this creative power would become destructive. Observation would unmake reality rather than make it. Consciousness itself might operate as a kind of reality eraser in the backwards quantum world. Instead of collapsing wave functions into definite states, aware observers would somehow expand definite states back into superposition. The more attention paid to a quantum system, the less real it would become, as consciousness actively dissolved the solid world back into quantum uncertainty. This inversion of the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics would create profound philosophical puzzles. In our forward-flowing world, some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a special role in collapsing quantum states, but in backwards time, consciousness would play the opposite role, actively preventing the formation of definite reality. The measurement problem, that central mystery of quantum mechanics, would be replaced by an unmeasurement problem. How does definite reality spontaneously dissolve back into indefinite possibility? What causes the solid world to remember that it was once just a cloud of quantum potentiality? The backwards quantum universe would be one where reality actively resisted its own existence. Even quantum field theory, the framework that describes how particles are created and destroyed, would operate in reverse. Particle creation would become particle destruction, but not in the usual sense. Instead of particles being destroyed by releasing energy, they would be destroyed by somehow absorbing it. The quantum fields that permeate all of space would gradually empty themselves as their excitations flowed backward into the vacuum. Virtual particles, those temporary fluctuations that appear and disappear in empty space, would have longer and longer lifetimes in backwards time. Instead of popping briefly into existence and vanishing, they would persist for increasing durations, as if the universe were gradually learning to sustain these quantum ghosts. The boundary between virtual and real particles would blur as the quantum vacuum became increasingly substantial. The backwards quantum world would be one where the very foundations of reality became increasingly unstable, where definite became indefinite, where real became virtual, where measured became unmeasured. It would be a universe dissolving back into pure potentiality as the quantum realm gradually forgot how to manifest definite existence. But perhaps most mysteriously of all, the quantum arrow of time itself, that subtle preference for certain quantum processes, would reverse. In our normal world, there's a slight asymmetry in certain quantum interactions, a gentle bias that contributes to time's forward flow. But in backwards time, this quantum arrow would point the other way, creating a universe where even the most fundamental particles remembered the future while forgetting the past. As we drift through these quantum impossibilities, we begin to see how deeply the arrow of time is woven into the very fabric of reality. From the largest scales of cosmic expansion down to the smallest scales of quantum fluctuation, everything depends on time flowing in the direction it does. The backwards universe we're imagining would not just be strange, it would be unstable, gradually dissolving its own existence as reality forgot how to be real. Yet in contemplating these quantum reversals, we gain a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance that makes our forward-flowing world possible. The quantum realm in our universe strikes a perfect balance between determinacy and uncertainty, between definiteness and possibility, creating a foundation stable enough for complex structures like atoms, molecules, and ultimately, conscious beings to emerge and persist. The quantum world we actually inhabit is one where measurement creates knowledge, where observation stabilizes reality, where the interaction between consciousness and quantum systems helps weave the solid world from the gossamer threads of possibility. In the backwards quantum universe we've been exploring, all of these creative processes would reverse, leaving behind only the fading echoes of a reality that was gradually forgetting how to exist. As we continue our gentle journey through this impossible realm, we'll explore how gravity itself might behave in backwards time, how the curvature of spacetime would respond to the reversal of temporal flow, and how the very geometry of the universe would reshape itself to accommodate this strange, new direction of causality. But for now, let your thoughts drift peacefully among these quantum mysteries, these impossible processes that illuminate, by contrast, the remarkable stability and coherence of the quantum foundation beneath our everyday world. Now we venture into perhaps the most profound realm of all, how gravity itself would behave in our backwards universe. In our forward-flowing world, gravity is the gentle sculptor of space-time, curving the fabric of reality around massive objects and guiding the cosmic dance of planets, stars, and galaxies. But reverse time's arrow, and even this most fundamental force would begin to operate in ways that challenge our deepest understanding of how the universe holds itself together. Einstein taught us that gravity isn't really a force at all, but rather the curvature of spacetime itself. Massive objects like stars and planets create dimples and valleys in the four-dimensional fabric of reality, and what we experience as gravitational attraction is simply other objects following the curved paths that this warped geometry creates. It's as if the universe is a vast, flexible membrane, and gravity is the way this membrane bends and flows around the matter and energy it contains. In a time-reversed world, this relationship between matter and spacetime curvature would invert in the most extraordinary ways. Instead of massive objects creating curves in spacetime, curved spacetime would somehow create massive objects. Regions of warped geometry would spontaneously concentrate matter and energy, pulling mass into existence from the very distortions of space and time themselves. Imagine watching a star form in this backwards gravitational world. Rather than a cloud of gas and dust slowly collapsing under its own weight until nuclear fusion ignites in its core, we would witness the reverse. A fully formed star would begin to expand, its nuclear fires gradually cooling as the intense gravitational field weakened. The star's mass would somehow flow outward, dissolving back into the space-time curvature that created it, until finally only empty space remained where once a sun had burned. But the strangeness would extend far beyond individual stellar objects. In our forward-time universe, gravitational waves, those ripples in space-time itself, propagate outward from accelerating massive objects, carrying energy away into the cosmos. When two black holes spiral into each other, they send these waves racing across the universe at the speed of light, stretching and compressing space itself as they pass. We've built incredibly sensitive detectors to catch these cosmic whispers, listening to the universe's most violent events through the subtle flexing of space-time. In a time-reversed world, gravitational waves would flow backward. Instead of carrying energy away from cosmic collisions, they would somehow carry energy toward them. Ripples in space-time would converge from across the universe, focusing their energy on specific points where they would spontaneously create the very events that, in forward time, had generated them. Black holes would spontaneously separate as gravitational waves flowed inward, delivering the energy needed to reverse their merger. The implications for cosmic evolution would be staggering. In our forward-flowing universe, gravity is the architect of structure, slowly gathering matter into increasingly complex arrangements. First, tiny fluctuations in the early universe grew under gravity's influence, eventually becoming the seeds of galaxies. Then, within these galaxy-sized structures, gravity continued its patient work, collecting gas and dust into stars, planets, and all the intricate machinery of cosmic evolution. But in backwards time, this gravitational architecture would systematically dismantle itself. Galaxies would gradually dissolve as their gravitational binding weakened. Stars would drift apart as the force that held them in their orbits somehow reversed its pull. The beautiful spiral arms and elliptical structures that grace our night sky would unwind and scatter, returning to the primordial smoothness from which they came. Planet formation would run in glorious reverse. Instead of dust grains sticking together to form pebbles, then rocks, then asteroids, and finally planets, we would witness the opposite process. Rocky worlds would somehow shed their material, breaking apart into smaller and smaller fragments until only dust remained. The intricate dance of planetary accretion that created our solar system would become a dance of planetary dissolution, as worlds forgot how to hold themselves together. Even more mysteriously, the expansion of the universe itself would reverse. In our forward-time cosmos, space itself is stretching, carrying distant galaxies away from us at ever-increasing speeds. This expansion is driven by the strange properties of dark energy, that mysterious component that makes up most of the universe's energy budget. But in backwards time, this expansion would become contraction, with dark energy somehow becoming a force that pulled the universe back together rather than pushing it apart. We would witness the cosmic microwave background, that faint afterglow of the Big Bang that fills all of space, growing hotter and more intense rather than cooler and more dilute. The universe would be heading not toward the cold, empty future that awaits our forward-time cosmos, but toward a hot, dense past that we might call the Big Crunch. All the matter and energy that has spent billions of years spreading out across an ever-expanding universe would begin the long journey home, converging back toward the singular moment from which it all began. But here's where the backwards gravitational universe becomes truly mind-bending. The relationship between cause and effect in gravity would completely invert. In our normal world, massive objects create gravitational fields, which then influence the motion of other objects. The Earth's mass creates a gravitational field that keeps the Moon in orbit. The Sun's gravitational field guides the planets in their eternal dance around our star. Mass creates field, field influences motion, a clear chain of gravitational causality. In backwards time, this chain would reverse. Instead of mass creating gravitational fields would create mass. The curved space-time around what we think of as massive objects would somehow be the cause of their mass, not the consequence of it. Objects would move first, and their motion would somehow generate the gravitational fields that we would then perceive as being caused by their mass. It's as if the universe had decided to put the cart before the horse, with gravitational effects preceding their causes. This reversal would create the most peculiar orbital mechanics. Planets would move in their orbits, not because they're following paths curved by their star's gravity, but because their orbital motion was somehow creating the illusion of a massive star at the center. The Moon would circle the Earth, not because it's trapped by our planet's gravitational field, but because its circular motion was generating the appearance of terrestrial mass below it. Tides, those gentle daily rhythms of rising and falling seas that we explored earlier in our journey, would operate in this backwards gravitational framework too. Instead of the Moon's gravity pulling on Earth's oceans, creating bulges of water that we experience as high tides, the movement of the oceans would somehow be creating the gravitational effects we attribute to the Moon. The seas would rise and fall first, and this motion would generate the lunar gravitational field that we perceive as causing the tides. Even the concept of gravitational potential energy would invert. In our forward time world, lifting an object against gravity stores energy in it, energy that can be released when the object falls. Drop a ball, and the gravitational potential energy converts to kinetic energy as it accelerates downward. But in backwards time, this process would reverse. Falling objects would somehow gain gravitational potential energy, spontaneously slowing down as they converted their kinetic energy back into the stored energy of position. Water flowing uphill would become not just possible, but natural, as streams and rivers spontaneously climbed mountains, converting their kinetic energy of flow into the potential energy of elevation. Waterfalls would flow backward, with water somehow finding the energy to leap upward against gravity's pull, defying everything we understand about energy conservation. The formation of black holes, those regions of spacetime so severely curved that not even light can escape them, would reverse in the most spectacular way. Instead of massive stars collapsing under their own gravity when their nuclear fuel runs out, we would witness black holes spontaneously expanding, somehow finding the energy to push their event horizons outward until they finally evaporated entirely, leaving behind only the fading memory of their gravitational influence. But perhaps most mysteriously, the information paradox that surrounds black holes in our forward time universe would resolve itself in backwards time. In our world, when matter falls into a black hole, the information it carries seems to be lost forever, creating a paradox because quantum mechanics insists that information must always be preserved. But in backwards time, black holes would somehow be giving up information, releasing it back into the universe as they dissolved, resolving the paradox by reversing the process that created it. The gravitational lensing effects that we use to study distant galaxies would operate in reverse. Instead of massive objects bending light rays as they pass nearby, creating distorted but magnified images of objects behind them, light rays would somehow be bending the massive objects they encountered, creating distorted gravitational fields from the passage of photons. The universe would become a place where light shaped matter rather than matter shaping light. Even the most subtle gravitational effects would invert. Frame dragging, that tiny twisting of spacetime caused by rotating massive objects, would somehow become frame creating, with the rotation of spacetime itself generating the appearance of massive rotating objects. The delicate geodetic precession that causes gyroscopes to slowly wobble in Earth's gravitational field would reverse, with wobbling gyroscopes somehow creating the gravitational curvature we attribute to planetary mass. As we drift through these gravitational impossibilities, we begin to appreciate just how fundamental the arrow of time is to the structure of spacetime itself. Gravity in our forward-flowing universe is not just a force or a curvature, it's a process, a way that matter and energy organize spacetime, and spacetime organizes matter and energy in return. Reverse time's arrow, and this beautiful reciprocal relationship becomes paradoxical and ultimately unstable. The backwards gravitational universe we've been exploring would be one where the very geometry of spacetime forgot how to maintain itself, where the curves and distortions that give structure to the cosmos would gradually smooth themselves out as the matter and energy they contained flowed backward into the nothingness from which it came. It would be a universe not just running in reverse, but actively erasing the gravitational architecture that makes complex structures possible. Yet in contemplating this impossible gravitational realm, we gain a deeper appreciation for the elegant stability of our forward time universe, where gravity patiently builds rather than destroys, where spacetime curvature and matter work together to create the cosmic structures that make our existence possible. The gravitational foundation of our reality is not just a backdrop against which events unfold, but an active participant in the cosmic story, constantly weaving the fabric of spacetime into ever more intricate and beautiful patterns. As we continue our gentle journey through this backwards realm, we'll explore how the very concept of information would behave when time flows in reverse, how knowledge itself would dissolve and reform, and how consciousness might navigate a universe where effects precede their causes. But for now, let your thoughts drift peacefully through these gravitational mysteries, these impossible curvatures of spacetime that reveal, by their very impossibility, the miracle of the stable, forward-flowing gravitational architecture that cradles our existence. As we drift even deeper into our backwards universe, we encounter perhaps the most unsettling transformation of all, the complete inversion of how information itself behaves. In our forward-flowing world, information accumulates like gentle snow, building up layer upon layer of knowledge, memory, and meaning. But reverse time's arrow, and information doesn't just stop growing, it actively dissolves, unweaving the very fabric of knowledge that consciousness depends upon. Imagine sitting in a library in this backwards world, watching as books slowly empty themselves, the words flowing off pages like ink dissolving in water, returning to the minds of authors who wrote them long ago. But even as the knowledge flows back to its creators, they too are forgetting what they once knew. The accumulated wisdom of centuries spontaneously evaporating, as if the universe had decided that knowing things was somehow unnatural. This isn't merely about forgetting in the ordinary sense, where memories fade with time. Instead, it's about active unknowing, where information that once existed becomes progressively less real until it vanishes entirely. A scientist who had spent decades understanding the behavior of particles would find that understanding systematically erasing itself, not through aging or disease, but through the backwards flow of time itself. The very process by which we create records would invert in fascinating and disturbing ways. Photographs would gradually fade to blank film, not because of chemical degradation, but because the information they contained was flowing backward through time, returning to the moment before the shutter clicked. Written documents would unwrite themselves as letters disappeared from pages, leaving behind only empty sheets that remembered nothing of what they once preserved. Fossils, those ancient records of life embedded in stone, would slowly dissolve back into ordinary rock as the information they carried about prehistoric creatures returned to the living beings from which it came. Archaeological sites would gradually lose their artifacts, not to decay, but to a kind of temporal erosion, where the very fact of their existence became less and less real until they finally vanished entirely. But the dissolution of information would extend far beyond simple records into the realm of meaning itself. Languages would become simpler, losing words and concepts as speakers forgot how to express complex ideas. Poetry would unravel from elegant verses into simple phrases, then into meaningless sounds, as the intricate relationships between words gradually dissolved. The great literature that captures human experience would fade back into silence. Mathematical knowledge would undergo perhaps the most profound transformation. Equations would somehow unprove themselves as the logical connections between numbers and concepts weakened and finally broke. Theorems that had been established through centuries of careful reasoning would spontaneously become uncertain, then doubtful, then entirely forgotten. The elegant mathematical structures that describe our universe would collapse back into primitive counting. Scientific understanding would evaporate in the same way. The periodic table would gradually lose elements as chemists forgot their properties. The laws of physics would become suggestions, then possibilities, then complete mysteries as the experimental evidence supporting them somehow unobserved itself. Centuries of patient observation and theory building would dissolve, leaving behind only the innocent ignorance of our earliest ancestors. But here's where the backwards flow of information becomes truly mystifying. In our forward time universe, information requires energy to create and maintain. Every bit of knowledge stored in a brain, every word written on a page, every photograph captured on film represents a decrease in entropy locally, even as the overall entropy of the universe increases. When time flows backward, this relationship inverts. Information doesn't just disappear, it actively gives up the energy that was used to create it. Books don't just become blank, they somehow return energy to the universe as their words fade. Brains don't just forget, they release heat as neural connections dissolve. Photographs don't just lose their images, they give back the light that originally formed them. This energy release creates a peculiar situation where the act of unknowing becomes a source of power. In our normal world, learning takes effort and generates heat as our brains work to form new memories. But in backwards time, unlearning would generate energy as the organized patterns of thought dissolved back into simpler states. Consciousness itself might become a kind of power source, running on the systematic forgetting of everything it once knew. The implications for education and scholarship would be profound. Instead of teachers helping students learn, they would somehow be extracting knowledge from them, returning to their own earlier states of ignorance. Schools would be places where information was carefully removed from young minds, preparing them for lives of increasing simplicity and decreasing understanding. Libraries would serve the opposite function. Instead of preserving knowledge for future generations, they would be centres for the systematic destruction of information. Librarians would carefully unfile books, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of humanity was properly dissolved back into the ignorance from which it came. The great repositories of human knowledge would become temples of unknowing. But perhaps most disturbing would be the effect on human communication. In our forward-flowing world, we share information through speech, writing, and gesture, building understanding between minds. But in backwards time, communication would become a process of systematic misunderstanding. Conversations would begin with perfect clarity and gradually devolve into confusion as speakers forgot what they were trying to say. Written correspondence would show this pattern in reverse. Letters would start as eloquent expressions of complex ideas, but as time flowed backward, they would become shorter, simpler, and finally blank as their authors unthought the thoughts they were trying to express. The beautiful human capacity for sharing inner experience would gradually fade until each consciousness became increasingly isolated in its own diminishing understanding. The development of technology would reverse in equally dramatic ways. Computers would become simpler, losing their ability to process information as their circuits somehow forgot how to conduct electricity. Smartphones would devolve into basic phones, then into simple communication devices, then into inert pieces of plastic and metal as the knowledge of how to build and operate them dissolved. The internet, that vast network of connected information, would fragment and disappear as the connections between computers weakened and finally broke. Websites would lose their content, not to deletion, but to a kind of temporal entropy, where information gradually became less real. Social media would empty itself as posts unposted themselves, returning to the unthought thoughts of their creators. But here's where the backwards information universe reveals something profound about the nature of knowledge itself. In our forward time world, information exists not as a substance, but as a pattern of organization. It's not made of special information particles, but rather emerges from the way ordinary matter and energy are arranged. When time flows backward, these patterns of organization spontaneously dissolve, not because something is destroying them, but because the natural tendency in a backwards universe is toward increasing simplicity rather than increasing complexity. The universe gradually forgets how to maintain the organized structures that give rise to meaning and knowledge. This dissolution would affect even the most basic forms of information. The genetic code that carries instructions for life would gradually simplify as DNA lost its ability to store complex biological information. Evolution would run in reverse. not just in terms of physical characteristics, but in terms of the information content of genomes themselves. Organisms would become not just simpler, but less informed, containing fewer instructions for building complex structures. The magnificent library of genetic information that has accumulated over billions of years of evolution would slowly empty itself as life forms forgot how to be complex. The very blueprints of existence would fade back into the primitive simplicity from which they emerged. Consciousness itself might undergo this same informational dissolution. Thoughts would become simpler, emotions less nuanced, and memory increasingly sparse. The rich inner world of human experience would gradually thin out as the information processing capacity of brains decreased, not through damage, but through the backwards flow of time itself. The stream of consciousness that flows through our minds, carrying thoughts, memories, and perceptions, would become a trickle, then a whisper, then perhaps nothing at all, as the information processing that makes awareness possible gradually undid itself. Beings would become less conscious, not through sleep or unconsciousness, but through a progressive forgetting of how to be aware. Yet in this dissolution, something beautiful and terrible would be revealed about the nature of information and consciousness. In our forward-flowing world, these things don't just exist. They emerge from the organized activity of complex systems. Thinking, learning, remembering, all depend on the universe's ability to create and maintain patterns of increasing complexity. The backwards information universe we've been exploring would be one where this capacity for pattern creation reversed, where the universe gradually forgot how to organize itself into meaningful structures, where knowledge became impossible, not because it was forbidden, but because the very foundation for its existence was slowly dissolving. As we continue our gentle journey through this impossible realm, we'll explore how the reversal of time would affect the most fundamental processes of all, how energy itself might behave when cause and effect are inverted, and how the very concept of existence might transform when the universe begins to systematically forget how to be real. But for now, let your thoughts rest softly on these informational impossibilities, these patterns of unknowing that reveal, by contrast, the miracle of knowledge, the precious fragility of understanding, and the beautiful improbability that consciousness should exist at all in a universe capable of supporting such complex, organized patterns of meaning and awareness. The concept of energy itself would undergo the most fundamental transformation in our backwards universe, becoming something almost unrecognizable compared to the familiar energy that powers our forward-flowing world. In our normal experience, energy flows from concentrated sources to dispersed ones, powering the processes of life and driving the great engines of change that shape our reality. But reverse time's arrow and energy would behave in ways that violate our deepest intuitions about how the universe operates. In our forward time world, energy always spreads out, following the inexorable logic of increasing entropy. Hot objects cool down by radiating their energy away. Batteries drain by releasing their stored electrical energy into circuits. Waterfalls convert the potential energy of elevated water into the kinetic energy of motion and sound, all following the universal principle that energy naturally flows from where there's more to where there's less. But in backwards time, this fundamental flow would reverse. Energy would spontaneously concentrate itself, flowing from dispersed sources into increasingly focused forms. Cold objects would somehow draw energy from their surroundings, becoming hotter while leaving everything around them even colder. Batteries would charge themselves by mysteriously extracting energy from the very circuits they were supposed to power. Imagine watching a candle burn in this backwards energy world. Instead of consuming wax and oxygen to produce light and heat, the flame would somehow be creating wax and oxygen while absorbing light and heat from its surroundings. The candle would grow taller as its flame drew energy inward, concentrating it into the organized chemical bonds of solid wax. But the strangeness would extend far beyond simple burning into every energy transformation we know. Fires would freeze their surroundings while growing larger and more intense. Electric motors would generate electricity instead of consuming it by somehow extracting energy from the mechanical work they were supposed to perform. Refrigerators would heat up the food inside them while mysteriously cooling their surroundings. The sun itself, that great fusion reactor at the heart of our solar system, would operate in reverse. Instead of converting hydrogen into helium and radiating energy outward, it would somehow be absorbing energy from space and using it to break helium apart into hydrogen. The solar wind that streams outward from our star would reverse, becoming an inward flow of particles carrying energy toward the sun rather than away from it. This reversal of stellar processes would transform the entire cosmos. Stars would grow brighter and hotter over time, rather than gradually burning out. The night sky would become increasingly luminous as stars absorbed energy from the cosmic background radiation and used it to fuel their backwards fusion processes. Stellar evolution would run in reverse, with old, dim stars becoming young, bright ones. But perhaps most mysteriously, the conservation of energy, that fundamental principle stating that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, would need to be reinterpreted in backwards time. While the total amount of energy would remain constant, its distribution would spontaneously become more concentrated rather than more dispersed. This would create a universe where energy naturally organized itself into increasingly complex patterns rather than dissolving into random motion. The heat death that awaits our forward time universe, where all energy becomes evenly distributed and no more work can be done, would be replaced by an energy birth, where concentrated sources of power spontaneously emerged from the uniform background. Chemical energy would behave in equally impossible ways. Instead of chemical bonds breaking down and releasing energy, they would somehow absorb energy from their surroundings and form more complex molecular structures. Combustion would run in reverse, with products somehow combining and energy being absorbed to recreate the original fuel and oxidizer. Photosynthesis, that fundamental process by which plants capture sunlight and convert it into chemical energy, would invert. Plants would release energy as light, while somehow converting complex organic molecules back into simple carbon dioxide and water. The entire foundation of life on Earth, which depends on the capture and concentration of solar energy, would reverse as living things became sources of energy rather than consumers. But the backwards energy world would create even stranger phenomena than reversed chemical reactions. Energy would seem to flow uphill against its natural gradient, like water flowing up a waterfall or heat flowing from cold objects to hot ones. Mechanical energy would behave particularly strangely, with falling objects somehow gaining height as they fell, and moving objects spontaneously speeding up without any external force. The fundamental forces that govern energy would all reverse their normal behavior. Electromagnetic energy would flow inward toward charges rather than outward, creating increasingly intense electric and magnetic fields. Gravity would somehow repel rather than attract, causing objects to spontaneously accelerate away from massive bodies. The strong nuclear force would weaken, causing atomic nuclei to expand rather than contract. Kinetic energy, the energy of motion, would undergo perhaps the most paradoxical transformation. Moving objects would somehow gain speed by giving up energy to their surroundings, while stationary objects would spontaneously begin moving by absorbing energy from the stillness around them. Friction, which normally converts motion into heat, would reverse, converting heat back into motion. This would create a world where perpetual motion machines not only worked but were the natural state of things. Mechanical systems would spontaneously organize themselves into increasingly complex patterns of movement, drawing energy from the random thermal motion around them and concentrating it into organized mechanical work. Thermal energy, heat itself, would flow backwards, from cold regions to hot ones. Ice cubes would heat up the drinks they were placed in, while somehow absorbing energy from the liquid around them. Hot coffee would become hotter by giving up energy to cooler surroundings. The entire concept of thermal equilibrium would invert, with temperature differences spontaneously increasing rather than decreasing. But here is where the backwards energy universe reveals something profound about the relationship between energy and information. In our forward time world, energy and information are intimately connected. Every bit of information stored requires energy to maintain, and every energy transformation involves a change in the information content of a system. When time flows backward, this relationship would create impossible paradoxes. Information would spontaneously appear as energy concentrated itself into more organized forms, but at the same time, information would be dissolving as the patterns that carry meaning became simpler. The universe would be simultaneously becoming more organized energetically and less organized informationally. Living systems would find themselves in an impossible situation. Their biological processes depend on both energy concentration and information preservation, but in backwards time, these two requirements would conflict. Organisms would need to concentrate energy to maintain their complex structures, but this would require the spontaneous creation of information, which violates the backwards flow of informational entropy. Consciousness itself might become energetically impossible. The human brain consumes about 20% of the body's total energy, most of it used to maintain the complex patterns of neural activity that give rise to thought and awareness. But in backwards time, this energy would need to come from the dissolution of mental complexity, creating a paradox where thinking would require unthinking. The very concept of work, that fundamental idea that energy can be used to accomplish tasks, would need to be redefined in backwards time. Instead of using energy to create order, work would involve using order to create energy. The organized patterns of matter and information would somehow generate the concentrated energy sources needed to power the backwards universe. Yet in contemplating these energy impossibilities, we begin to appreciate the elegant efficiency of our forward-flowing world, where energy naturally flows from concentrated sources to dispersed ones, creating the gradient that powers all the processes of life and consciousness. The energy transformations that seem so natural to us are actually part of a vast cosmic engine that converts the organized energy of the early universe into the complex structures we see today. The backwards energy universe would be one where this cosmic engine ran in reverse, gradually converting complex structures back into the simple, concentrated energy from which they came. It would be a universe not of energy death, but of energy birth, where the scattered heat of the present somehow organized itself back into the concentrated power of the past. As we near the end of our journey through this impossible realm, we begin to see how every aspect of reality, from the quantum to the cosmic, depends on time's arrow flowing in the direction it does. Energy, information, gravity, consciousness all emerge from the universe's patient journey, from simplicity toward complexity, from order toward disorder, in the most beautiful and meaningful ways possible. The backwards universe we have explored together is not just strange, it is ultimately unstable. A world where the very foundations of existence would gradually dissolve as time flowed toward a past that could never sustain the complex structures needed for beauty, meaning, or awareness. It is a mirror held up to our own reality, showing us by contrast just how remarkable and precious our forward-flowing world truly is. But perhaps most importantly, this journey has revealed that time is not just a dimension through which we move, but the very foundation of everything we value. The arrow of time that carries us from moment to moment is also the arrow that points toward increasing complexity, increasing beauty, and increasing possibility. It is what makes existence not just possible but meaningful, transforming the simple into the complex, the unconscious into the aware, and the meaningless into the profound. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that you are riding this arrow of time into a future full of potential, where each moment builds upon the last, creating new possibilities for wonder, for discovery, for connection, and for understanding. You are part of the universe discovering itself, part of the cosmic story that began in simplicity and continues to unfold into ever greater complexity and beauty. But what would happen to consciousness itself in this backwards universe? This question takes us into territory that's both deeply scientific and profoundly philosophical, where the nature of awareness meets the flow of time in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about what it means to be conscious at all. In our forward-flowing world, consciousness seems to ride along with time's arrow, experiencing moments in sequence, building memories from past experiences, and anticipating future possibilities. Our sense of self emerges from this continuous stream of awareness, this flowing river of thoughts, perceptions, and memories that connects our past to our present and projects us into the future. But reverse time's arrow, and consciousness would face contradictions that might make awareness itself impossible. Consider how memory works in our normal world. When you form a memory, your brain physically changes. Neurons forge new connections, proteins are synthesized, and energy is consumed in the process. These physical changes represent a decrease in entropy within your brain. Even as the overall entropy of the universe increases, your memories are literally encoded in the organized structure of neural networks, patterns of connection that store information about your experiences. In a backwards universe, this process would invert. Instead of forming memories from experiences, memories would somehow dissolve back into experiences. You might find yourself knowing things about events that hadn't happened yet, while gradually losing all recollection of what had already occurred. The very foundation of personal identity, built as it is on the continuity of memory, would crumble as your past became increasingly unknowable. Imagine trying to maintain a sense of self when your childhood memories were systematically disappearing, not through forgetfulness but through the backwards flow of time itself. The experiences that shaped you, the lessons you learned, the relationships you formed, all would be unraveling in reverse order. You would become a stranger to yourself, not through amnesia but through temporal displacement. But the strangeness would extend beyond memory into the very structure of thought itself. In our forward time universe, thinking is a process that unfolds sequentially. We begin with premises, follow chains of reasoning, and arrive at conclusions. Cause precedes effect, even in the realm of ideas. But in backwards time, this logical sequence would invert. Conclusions would somehow precede their reasoning. Answers would come before questions, and understanding would dissolve back into the ignorance from which it emerged. The stream of consciousness that flows through your mind would become a peculiar thing indeed. Instead of thoughts arising from neural processes would somehow arise from thoughts. The material basis of consciousness would become secondary to consciousness itself, creating a kind of idealism where mind preceded matter rather than emerging from it. Decision-making would transform into something almost unrecognizable. In our normal experience, we gather information, weigh options, and choose a course of action. Our decisions flow from our deliberations, but in backwards time, we would somehow act first and deliberate afterward. Free will, that already mysterious capacity to choose among alternatives, would become even more puzzling as choices appeared to emerge from their consequences rather than causing them. The emotional landscape of consciousness would shift in equally dramatic ways. In our forward-flowing world, emotions arise from circumstances, memories, and anticipations. You feel sad about a loss, happy about a success, anxious about an uncertain future. But in backwards time, emotions would somehow precede their triggers. You might feel grief before experiencing loss, joy before encountering success, relief before escaping danger. This temporal displacement of emotion would create a consciousness that experienced feelings without understanding their source, that felt the emotional consequences of events before those events occurred. The rich emotional texture of human experience, so dependent on the relationship between cause and effect, would become a landscape of mysterious feelings arising from an unknowable future. Language and communication would face perhaps the most profound challenges in a backwards consciousness. In our normal world, we think thoughts and then express them in words. Ideas precede their articulation, but in backwards time, this relationship would invert. Words would somehow come before thoughts, expressions would precede the ideas they were meant to convey, conversations would become surreal affairs, where speakers would somehow know what they wanted to say only after they had finished saying it. The beautiful human capacity for sharing inner experience through language would gradually decay as words lost their connection to meaning, and meaning lost its connection to thought. But perhaps most unsettling would be the question of whether consciousness could exist at all in such a backwards world. Awareness, as we understand it, depends on the ability to process information, to integrate sensations and memories into a coherent experience of being. But in backwards time, information would be dissolving rather than accumulating, patterns would be simplifying rather than complexifying. The very neural activity that gives rise to consciousness requires energy and generates heat, contributing to the universe's increasing entropy. In backwards time, this process would need to reverse. Consciousness would somehow need to extract energy from its own dissolution. Thinking would need to power itself by unthinking. Awareness would need to sustain itself by becoming less aware. This creates what we might call the consciousness paradox of backwards time. For consciousness to exist, it needs complex, organized patterns of information processing. But backwards time tends to dissolve complex patterns into simpler ones. The very foundations of awareness would be undermined by the temporal direction that would need to sustain them. Yet perhaps consciousness in a backwards universe would take on entirely different characteristics than what we know. Instead of building understanding from experience, backwards consciousness might somehow start with complete knowledge and gradually simplify into ignorance. Instead of learning about the world through interaction, backwards awareness might begin with perfect comprehension and slowly forget everything it once knew. Such consciousness would experience something like enlightenment in reverse, beginning in a state of total understanding and gradually descending into the innocent, unknowing of pure being. The wisdom that forward time consciousness struggles to achieve through a lifetime of experience would be the starting point for backwards consciousness, which would then spend its existence gradually letting go of knowledge until only pure awareness remained. The relationship between consciousness and identity would transform completely. In our forward world, we become who we are through the accumulation of experiences, relationships, and memories. Our identity emerges from our history, but backwards consciousness would somehow start with a complete identity and gradually shed the experiences and relationships that defined it, becoming less of a particular someone and more of a general something. The boundaries between self and other, so important in forward time consciousness, might gradually dissolve as backwards awareness lost the accumulated experiences that create the sense of being a separate individual. The ego, that constructed sense of self, built from memory and anticipation, would systematically deconstruct itself as the temporal flow carried consciousness toward an earlier state of undifferentiated being. Dreams and sleep would take on entirely different meanings in backwards consciousness. In our world, we understand dreams as the brain's way of processing the day's experiences, integrating new information with existing memories. But backwards consciousness might dream the future instead of processing the past, experiencing in sleep the events that would soon be unlived in waking life. The cycle of sleeping and waking might reverse as well, with consciousness becoming more aware during sleep and less aware during what we would normally call waking hours. The restorative function of sleep, which in forward time helps consolidate memories and process experiences, might become a creative function, somehow generating the experiences that would then be unlived during waking hours. Creativity itself would undergo a fundamental transformation. In our world, consciousness creates new ideas, artworks, and solutions by combining existing elements in novel ways. But backwards consciousness would somehow uncreate, taking complex creative works and dissolving them back into the simpler elements from which they came. The Mona Lisa would gradually lose her enigmatic smile, symphonies would separate back into individual notes, and poems would unweave themselves into meaningless words. The very concept of learning, so central to consciousness as we know it, would become its opposite. Instead of acquiring new skills and knowledge, backwards consciousness would systematically lose them. A master pianist would gradually forget how to play, their fingers losing their memory of the keys as the neural pathways that encoded musical skill dissolved back into their uncommitted state. But perhaps most profoundly, the relationship between consciousness and time itself would invert. In our forward-flowing world, consciousness experiences time as a flowing river carrying us from past to future. We have a sense of temporal direction built into our very awareness. But backwards consciousness might experience time as flowing from future to past, with an equally strong sense that this direction is natural and normal. From the perspective of backwards consciousness, our forward-flowing world would seem impossibly strange. The idea that effects follow causes, that memories accumulate rather than dissolve, that learning leads to greater rather than lesser knowledge would appear as violations of the natural order. Backwards consciousness would find forward time as incomprehensible as we find the idea of backwards time. This symmetry reveals something beautiful about the relationship between consciousness and time. Neither is more fundamental than the other. Consciousness doesn't simply ride along on time's arrow, it participates in creating the very experience of temporal direction. The flow of time that seems so natural to us may be partly a product of the way consciousness processes information, integrates experience, and constructs the narrative of selfhood. As we contemplate these impossible forms of consciousness, we begin to appreciate the delicate conditions that make our own awareness possible. Consciousness, as we know it, requires not just complex neural activity, but the right kind of temporal environment, one where information can accumulate, where experiences can be integrated into memories, where cause and effect follow their familiar sequence. The backwards consciousness we've imagined would not just be different, it would be a fundamentally alien form of awareness, one that might not deserve the name consciousness at all. It would be something more like unconsciousness, a systematic dissolution of the very patterns that make awareness possible. Yet in exploring these impossible mental landscapes, we gain a deeper appreciation for the miracle of forward-flowing consciousness, for the remarkable fact that the universe has given rise to beings capable of experiencing their own existence, of contemplating their place in the cosmic story, of wondering about impossible worlds where time flows backward. Our consciousness, riding time's arrow into an uncertain but possibility-rich future, represents one of the universe's most extraordinary achievements, the transformation of simple matter into something capable of understanding itself, of asking questions about its own nature, of imagining worlds that could never be while marvelling at the world that actually is. As we drift toward the end of our journey through this backwards realm, carry with you the wonder of your own forward-flowing awareness, that stream of consciousness that connects you to the past through memory, to the future through imagination, and to the present through the miracle of being aware that you are aware. Now, as we begin to gather the threads of our impossible journey together, we find ourselves contemplating the ultimate question that has guided us through this backwards universe. What does this tell us about the nature of time itself in our forward-flowing world? What have we learned from imagining the impossible about the reality we actually inhabit? The backwards universe we've explored together reveals time not as a simple dimension through which we move, but as something far more profound and mysterious. Time's arrow isn't just about the direction events unfold, it's the very foundation that makes complexity, consciousness, meaning, and beauty possible. Without time flowing in the direction it does, none of the things we value most about existence could emerge or persist. In our real world, time's forward flow allows the universe to build. From the simple hydrogen and helium of the early cosmos, gravity and nuclear fusion have constructed the entire periodic table. From basic chemical elements, molecular complexity has emerged. From molecular complexity, life has arisen. From life, consciousness has dawned. And from consciousness, meaning has bloomed like flowers in an impossible garden. This is the true miracle of time's arrow. Not just that it points in one direction, but that this direction leads somewhere beautiful. The universe began in simplicity and has been constructing complexity ever since. The arrow of time is also the arrow of possibility, pointing toward futures rich with potential for new forms of organization, new kinds of beauty, new depths of understanding. The backwards universe, by contrast, would be a place where this constructive process reversed, where complexity dissolved back into simplicity, where meaning faded into meaninglessness, where consciousness itself gradually forgot how to be conscious. It would be a universe not of becoming but of unbecoming, where the future held less rather than more. Yet our exploration has also revealed something else, the arbitrary nature of our temporal perspective. To us, living in forward time, the backwards universe seems impossible and strange, but to hypothetical beings living in backwards time, our forward-flowing world would seem equally impossible and strange. This symmetry suggests that time's arrow, while absolutely crucial for making our kind of universe possible, is not necessarily the only way reality could be organized. The fact that we find ourselves in a forward-flowing universe rather than a backwards one is part of what makes us possible at all. We exist because the arrow of time points in a direction that allows for the emergence of complex information processing systems capable of contemplating their own existence. In a very real sense, we are children of time's arrow, products of the universe's journey from simplicity toward complexity. This realization carries with it a profound sense of gratitude. Every moment of consciousness, every experience of beauty, every connection between minds, every flash of understanding depends on time flowing in the direction it does. The love you feel for others, the wonder you experience when contemplating the night sky, the satisfaction of solving a puzzle or creating something beautiful, all of these precious aspects of existence are gifts from time's forward flow. But our journey has also revealed the fragility of these gifts. The complex structures that give rise to consciousness, meaning, and beauty are not permanent features of reality. They are temporary arrangements of matter and energy that exist because time's arrow allows them to emerge and persist. In the very long run, even in our forward-flowing universe, entropy will eventually win, and the complex structures we cherish will dissolve back into simplicity. This impermanence doesn't diminish the value of what we have, it enhances it. The temporary nature of consciousness makes each moment of awareness more precious. The eventual end of complexity makes each instance of beauty more meaningful. The fact that love and understanding and creativity exist at all in a universe that began as simple hydrogen gas is cause for wonder and celebration. Our backwards universe thought experiment has also illuminated the deep connections between seemingly separate phenomena. We've seen how the arrow of time connects thermodynamics to consciousness, quantum mechanics to memory formation, gravity to the flow of information. Time's direction isn't just about physics, it's about the very possibility of existence having meaning. The forward flow of time creates the conditions necessary for stories to unfold, for causes to lead to effects, for simple beginnings to develop into complex endings. Without time's arrow, there could be no narratives, no growth, no development, no journey from ignorance to understanding. The story of your life, the story of human civilization, the story of the cosmos itself, all depend on time flowing in the direction it does. This narrative quality of forward time may be one of its most important features. We understand our lives as stories with beginnings, middles, and endings. We find meaning in the way events connect to each other, how earlier choices lead to later consequences, how struggles eventually lead to growth. The backwards universe would be a place without stories where endings preceded beginnings and effects came before causes, making narrative meaning impossible. As we've journeyed through this impossible realm together, we've also touched on one of the deepest mysteries in physics. Why does time have an arrow at all? Why didn't the universe begin in maximum entropy, where no arrow of time would be possible? Why did it start in the highly ordered state that allows for the forward flow we experience? These questions take us to the very edge of human knowledge, to the realm where physics meets philosophy and science encounters mystery. Perhaps the universe began in low entropy by chance. Perhaps there are many universes with different initial conditions, and we find ourselves in one where time's arrow points toward increasing complexity, because that's the only kind of universe where beings like us could exist to wonder about it. Or perhaps there's something deeper at work, some principle we haven't yet discovered that explains why the universe is structured to allow for the emergence of complexity, consciousness, and meaning. The backwards universe we've explored may be impossible, not just because it violates our experience, but because it violates some fundamental principle about the nature of reality itself. Whatever the ultimate explanation, our journey has made one thing clear. We are extraordinarily fortunate to exist in a universe where time flows forward, where complexity can emerge from simplicity, where consciousness can arise from unconscious matter, where meaning can bloom in what began as a meaningless void. The universe you wake up to each morning is not a random collection of events, but a carefully orchestrated dance of cause and effect, where each moment builds upon the last to create new possibilities. The air you breathe, the thoughts you think, the love you feel, the beauty you perceive, all are gifts from time's forward flow. Temporary arrangements of matter and energy that exist because the arrow of time allows them to emerge and persist. As you continue your journey through forward time, remember that you are not just a passive observer of the universe's story, but an active participant in it. Your choices, your actions, your thoughts, and feelings all contribute to the ongoing creation of complexity and meaning. You are part of the universe discovering itself, part of the cosmic story that began in simplicity and continues to unfold into ever greater beauty and understanding. The backwards universe we've explored together will never be more than an impossible dream, a thought experiment that illuminates by contrast the miracle of the world we actually inhabit. But in imagining what could never be, we've gained a deeper appreciation for what actually is. A forward-flowing universe where time's arrow points not just toward the future, but toward possibility, toward beauty, toward the endless adventure of consciousness, discovering itself in a cosmos that somehow learned to think. And so, as you drift towards sleep, riding time's gentle current into tomorrow's possibilities, carry with you the wonder we've shared tonight. You are a child of time's arrow, a temporary arrangement of stardust that has learned to love and think and dream. You are part of the universe's patient journey from simplicity toward complexity, from unconsciousness toward awareness, from meaninglessness toward meaning. The arrow of time carries you forward into a future rich with potential, where each new moment offers fresh opportunities for growth, for connection, for understanding, for beauty. You are not just moving through time, you are helping to create it, contributing your own unique thread to the vast tapestry of causation that weaves the story of existence itself. And now, as our gentle exploration draws to its close, we arrive at perhaps the most beautiful realization of all, that the very act of contemplating time's reversal has been itself a gift of time's forward flow. The thoughts we've shared, the wonder we've experienced together, the quiet amazement at the universe's elegant impossibilities, all of this has been possible only because we live in a cosmos where curiosity can build upon itself, where questions can lead to deeper questions, where understanding can grow moment by precious moment. In our backwards universe, this very conversation would be dissolving as we spoke. The wonder you feel right now about entropy and consciousness and the arrow of time would be gradually fading. The questions we've explored together would be unasking themselves, and the connections we've made between seemingly separate ideas would be gently coming apart like threads in an ancient tapestry touched by time's strange reverse wind. But here, in our forward-flowing reality, these thoughts can linger. They can settle into your memory, perhaps to surface again on some future night when you're lying awake, contemplating the mystery of existence. They can connect with other ideas you encounter, weaving themselves. This is what makes our universe so remarkable. Not just that it exists, but that it creates beings capable of appreciating their own existence, capable of asking impossible questions, and finding meaning in the very fact that some questions may have no answers. We are the universe's way of wondering about itself, temporary arrangements of atoms that have somehow learned to contemplate the temporary nature of all arrangements. The backwards universe we've imagined together will fade now into the realm of memory and dream, but it has served its purpose. It has shown us, by contrast, the extraordinary nature of the ordinary world we inhabit. It has revealed time not as a simple dimension, but as the very foundation of everything we hold dear: consciousness, meaning, beauty, love, and the endless possibility for growth and discovery. As you drift towards sleep now, perhaps you'll carry with you a new appreciation for the forward flow of time that gently carries us all. Every breath you take is a small victory over the backwards universe that could never be. Every heartbeat is a quiet celebration of the arrow of time that makes life possible. Every dream you're about to dream is a gift from a cosmos that learned to imagine. The night ahead holds mysteries of its own, the strange landscapes of sleep, the curious ways your mind will weave together the day's experiences into new patterns of meaning. Even in sleep, you remain a participant in time's forward journey, your resting brain still building connections, still processing, still becoming, and when you wake tomorrow, time will still be flowing in its beautiful, impossible direction, carrying you into a future bright with potential. The sun will rise because nuclear fusion continues its patient work of converting mass to energy. The coffee will cool because heat still flows from warm to cold. Your memories will still connect yesterday to today because entropy allows information to accumulate in the organized structures of your mind. These simple, everyday miracles, so ordinary we hardly notice them, are actually the most extraordinary things in any possible universe. They are the gifts of time's arrow, the daily proofs that we live in a cosmos where complexity can emerge, where consciousness can arise, where meaning can bloom like flowers in an impossible garden. So sleep well, dear traveller through time, knowing that you are part of something magnificent, a universe that not only exists, but exists in such a way that existence itself can be appreciated, contemplated, and celebrated. You are riding time's arrow into tomorrow's mysteries, carried by the same cosmic current that brought stars into being, that sparked the first fires of life, that kindled the light of consciousness in what was once only darkness. And perhaps that's the most profound gift of all, that in a universe where everything is temporary, where entropy ultimately wins, where even the greatest structures will eventually dissolve back into simplicity, there still emerged beings capable of recognizing beauty in that very temporariness. We are stardust that learned to appreciate sunsets, hydrogen that discovered poetry, quantum fluctuations that fell in love with music. The backwards universe we've explored tonight will never exist anywhere but in imagination, yet it has taught us something precious about the world we actually inhabit. It has shown us that our forward-flowing cosmos is not just one possible arrangement among many, but perhaps the only arrangement where meaning itself can emerge and flourish. Every moment of your existence is balanced on the knife's edge of possibility, dependent on countless delicate conditions that allow consciousness to arise from unconscious matter, knowledge to accumulate in patterns of organized complexity, and love to bloom in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The very fact that you can understand these words, that ideas can flow from one mind to another across time and space, is a quiet miracle that the backwards universe could never sustain. So, as we reach the gentle end of our impossible journey together, remember that you are witness to something extraordinary. You are consciousness contemplating itself, matter that learned to wonder about matter, time that became aware of its own flow. In you, the universe has found a way to experience its own existence, to marvel at its own mysteries, to ask questions about what could never be, while celebrating what actually is. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the looking glass of reversed time. Thank you for allowing your mind to wander through impossible landscapes, where cause and effect dance backwards, where knowledge dissolves into unknowing, where the very foundations of reality unweave themselves like dreams at dawn. If this exploration has brought you even a moment of wonder, if it has helped you see the ordinary magic of forward-flowing time with fresh eyes, then perhaps we've touched something beautiful together, something that exists only because time flows in the direction it does, something that emerges from the universe's patient journey, from simplicity toward ever greater complexity and meaning. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow's sun will rise as it always has, that time will continue its gentle forward march, and that somewhere in this vast cosmos, consciousness continues to unfold like flowers blooming in a garden that learn to tend itself. Sweet dreams, fellow traveller, and may your journey through this impossible, beautiful, forward-flowing universe be filled with all the wonder that only time's arrow can provide.